Well, thank you, Emily, so much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for being here and for inviting me. I think it's actually starting to rain out there, so some of you may have to huddle up in the tent. In any event, I want to keep my remarks relatively brief this morning so I can answer as many of your questions as I can. But earlier today, I was on Meet the Press, and it seemed to be news, big news, that when asked whether I thought Hillary Clinton had lied about Benghazi, I said yes. I was then asked why I thought she had lied about Benghazi. And I said, well, by any common sense definition of the word lie, you're lying when you know something is a purposeful terrorist attack, and nevertheless you get up the next day and talk about a video that doesn't represent the values of the American people, and several days later you talk about the same video over the bodies of the fallen, when what you should have said, and yes, Mrs. Clinton, it makes a lot of difference, what you should have said was, this was a purposeful terrorist attack and we will seek retribution. You see, it still is news when we speak plainly in politics. I start with that story because I think Emily is absolutely right that in 2016 we have to win this job. We actually have to win in 2016. But we also need a leader who can do the job because the nation is at a pivotal point. I believe we have strayed too far away from what our founders intended with a citizen government. I think we have way too many decisions that are being made by a careless, thoughtless, incompetent, corrupt bureaucracy instead of in the communities where people are most affected by that decision. And I believe we have indeed come to a pivotal point in our nation's history where the potential of too many Americans, indeed where the potential of this nation is being crushed by a government that has grown so big, so complex, so powerful, so weighty, so incompetent, so corrupt, and by a professional political class that cares more about its own power, privilege, and position than on getting anything done. I think it is a pivotal point. Before I talk briefly about what it will take to do the job, I want to talk about what it will take to win the job, and that's why I started with Meet the Press. Because to win the job, I believe we need a nominee who will fight every step of the way, who will throw every punch we have at whoever the nominee is on the other side. Currently, Mrs. Clinton remains the Democrat Party's front runner. She may or may not be their nominee, but whoever their nominee is, we need a nominee on our side who will fight every step of the way. And it's not just about throwing the punches that we have, like, yes, indeed, Mrs. Clinton lied. Not just about Benghazi, but about her emails and her server as well. But I think it's also about reintroducing people to the values that we hold dear. Reintroducing people, if you will, to who the Republican Party actually is. I started to do that when I went on The View a couple months ago. The View isn't exactly a conservative show, but I have a reputation for going on virtually any show and answering any question, whether that means having a round with Chris Matthews or going on The View. So I was on The View. I had quite a good time. I like all their hosts, and halfway through the interview, they were kind of liking me. And so Rosie Perez, one of their wonderful hosts, she's a lovely woman, and she said, you know, with that tone, because she likes me, it was clear, and she said, why are you a Republican? You know that tone, right? Why are you a Republican? She said, I'm not, you know. I said, Rosie, I'm shocked. I would never have guessed that. I answered this way. I said, I'm a Republican because I know no one of us is any better than any other one of us. Every one of us has God-given gifts. Every one of us has the potential to live a life of dignity and purpose and meaning. And I know our values, our principles, and our policies work better to lift everyone up. She was stunned by the answer. But, of course, it's true. And we have to reintroduce all of that to the American people in order to win this election. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. When I was a little girl, My mother said to me one Sunday morning, she looked at me the way moms sometimes look at their kids, and she said, "What you are is God's gift to you. What you make of yourself is your gift to God." Those words sort of landed in my life because I didn't feel very gifted as a little girl or as a young woman. And so her words were sort of a promise to me that I had God-given gifts somewhere, and they were a challenge as well, that I needed to find them and use them. From my father, I learned conservative values. I would sit at his knee every night and watch him watch the news. I would watch him yell at Walter Cronkite. I would ask him why, and he would explain. And then in the morning, I would watch him read the New York Times, and he would yell at the New York Times, and he would explain to me why. From both of my parents, I learned that integrity is the greatest asset each one of us have. That character counts. That values are what guide your behavior when no one is looking and you don't think anyone will ever find out. I would go on to graduate with a degree in medieval history and philosophy. Exactly. Exactly. All dressed up, nowhere to go. I am unemployable. It's the middle of a deep recession, and so I go off and do full-time what I had done part-time to put myself through college. I was a Kelly girl in college. We don't call them that anymore. We call them Kelly personnel, but we were mostly young women who typed and filed as temporary office personnel. So I went off and got hired by a 9-person real estate firm to type and file and answer their phones. My husband Frank, of 30 years, started out as a tow truck driver in a family-owned auto body shop. Now, I have traveled and lived and worked, done business, done charity, done policy work all over the world, in every continent. I know more world leaders on the stage today than anyone running, with the possible exception of Hillary Clinton, although I did not do photo ops. I had real meetings. And having traveled and lived and worked all over the world, I know this. It is only in this nation that a young woman can start out typing and filing and answering the phones in the middle of a deep recession, go on eventually to become the chief executive of what we turned into the largest technology company in the world, and run for the presidency of the United States. That is only possible here. And it's possible here because our founders knew what my mother taught me. Our founders knew everybody has God-given gifts. Our founders knew what I have learned over and over and over in my life. Everybody has potential. Most people have far more than they realize, and the issue is, do they get the chance to fulfill their potential? But our founders built a nation on this amazing idea. It was radical at the time. It is visionary still. The idea is this. Here in this nation, you have a right to fulfill your potential, to find and use your God-given gifts. That is what they meant when they said life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And the radical part of that idea was they said that right comes from God and should not be taken away by man or government. But we have come to a place where those rights to find and use your God-given gifts, to fulfill your potential, are indeed being taken away by government. They are getting taken away when we tangle people's lives up in webs of dependence from which they cannot escape. I have met many of these people. People who have God-given gifts, who have ambition, but every incentive we give them, if they are on some kind of dependence program, is not to move forward with their lives, but instead to fall back. And it is why generation after generations of certain families are dependent. We are crushing the potential of this nation when, for the first time in U.S. history, we are now destroying more businesses than we are creating. And guess not what? We're not destroying the big businesses. We're destroying the small, the 9-person real estate firm, the family-owned farm, the family-owned auto body shop that my husband Frank started out in. And that matters deeply, hugely actually, because it is those small, family-owned, community-based businesses and farms that create 2/3 of the new jobs in this country and employ half the people. And why are we crushing all those businesses? Because government has grown so big, so powerful, so complicated, that only the big, the powerful, the wealthy, and the well-connected can handle it. It is called crony capitalism, ladies and gentlemen. And the bigger government gets, the worse it gets. So as the chief executive of a $90 billion firm, that's roughly what Hewlett-Packard was by the time I left. If we had a 73,000 page tax code, which is what we have today, or we had a regulatory thicket, well, I could hire accountants and lawyers and lobbyists, but the 9-person real estate firm can't. I've spent the last 5 days here in New Hampshire, and I've spent a lot of that time in the North Country. And I met a man who owns a sawmill. It is the heart of his community. It employs most of the people. He's been in that business for 40 years. I asked him, could you start that business today? He said, no way. Then I met a farmer down the road who's a flower farmer. And he said, I'm almost embarrassed to hand over my business to my children because it is so difficult every single day. And if the Environmental Protection Agency, how many of you have heard of the long-eared bat? Okay, well, there's a long-eared bat here in New Hampshire, and if the long-eared bat is determined by the Environmental Protection Agency to be an endangered species and not just a threatened species, let me tell you, that sawmill's going out of business. Just like the timber industry was put out of business by the EPA in the Northwest a decade and a half ago. The big get bigger, the wealthy get wealthier. The powerful and the well-connected get more powerful and more well-connected, and meanwhile the powerless and the small are getting crushed. And that crushes all of us. You know, when I was once I became a CEO, people would say to me, how did you go from being a secretary to a CEO? And the truth is, I didn't have a plan to do that. But I found that I would run to problems. And every time I ran to a problem, I would find people who knew how to solve the problem. It's just they'd never been asked. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think you know how to solve these problems. And so I'm going to ask you, literally, how is it that we cut a bureaucracy down to size? The federal government has become a giant, bloated, corrupt, inept bureaucracy. How do we cut it down to size? Well, there are a couple things we have to do. You know this. First, we got to start by knowing where your money is being spent. We don't know. We need to go to some version of zero-based budgeting so that every single dollar has to be justified every single year. That's the only way we can spend less overall and yet invest what we do spend more wisely and well. We have to have a system that has some relationship to performance on the job. It can't be okay for federal government employees to watch pornography all day long. We know this from Inspector General reports, that you can watch pornography all day long in a federal government job and earn the same pay, pension, and benefits as somebody doing a good job. And we just found out a couple days ago that there's some website, Ashley something, I don't know the name. If you do, don't mention it because people will wonder why you do. But there's some website that you go on to if you're looking for an extramarital affair. And we got loads of federal government employees on the job going to this website. And guess what? Nothing happens. So I said, you know the answers. I am going to go into the Oval Office on a regular basis, and I'm going to ask you for the answers and use your anger and your frustration, because we all have it, against this out-of-control federal government to fix it. So I will ask you to take out your smartphones. Technology is a great tool, ladies and gentlemen, to re-engage citizens in the process of their government. I will ask you to take out your smartphones. By the way, I must say, this is a warning. You've got 18 months. I have seen a lot of flip phones here in New Hampshire. You really need to upgrade before January of 2017, okay? So when you upgrade to a smartphone, okay, when you upgrade, I will ask you, maybe in the weekly radio address, I will say, fellow citizens, please take out your smartphones. I'd like to ask you a couple questions. Do you think it's important that we know where your money is being spent and that we actually ask agencies to justify every single dollar they spend every single year? Press 1 for yes, 2 for no. This technology exists, ladies and gentlemen. You will press 1 for yes. And so will tens of millions of your fellow citizens. I might ask you another question. Do you think we ought to have some measures of performance in the federal government, some consequence for non-performance? Do you think we actually ought to be able to fire somebody in the federal government if they are willfully not doing their job? So altogether, together now. 1 for yes, 2 for no. Now, why am I going to ask you those questions? Because A, you know the answer to them. But B, what do we know the professional political class responds to? Pressure. Pressure. The political class actually will act when they face enough pressure. If you doubt that, think about what happened when we first learned of the VA scandal. Remember the Arizona wait times? People were dying, waiting for an appointment. The American people were outraged. And because of that outrage, they flooded their congressional offices with emails and calls. And guess what happened? In 3 weeks, a bipartisan bill was passed that you could fire the top 400 senior executives at the VA, and President Obama signed it without a peep. Now, by the way, one person's been fired. A month ago, we learned that 256,000 veterans have died waiting for appointments. And have you heard a thing from the professional politicians? Nope. But it demonstrates that politicians will respond to pressure. So I will ask the American people the answers to a whole set of questions that actually your common sense and good judgment tell you what the right thing to do is here. So let's talk about what it takes to do that job in addition to everything that I've just said. We need a president who actually understands how the economy works, who understands the difference between crony capitalism and real job creation. She must understand how the world works. Kind of has a ring to it, doesn't it? She must understand how the world works and who is in the world. As I mentioned, I know more world leaders on the stage today than anyone running. So, I've had a private meeting with Vladimir Putin, not a photo op. And anyone who spent any time at all with him would know that you do not change his behavior with a gimmicky red reset button. You know what I would do with Vladimir Putin? I wouldn't talk to him. Not at all. I'd quit talking to his foreign minister as well, but I would immediately begin rebuilding the Sixth Fleet, rebuilding the missile defense programs in Poland, conducting regular military exercises in the Baltic states. And trust me, Vladimir Putin will get the message. If you understand the world and how it works, you know that America is truly the indispensable nation. It doesn't mean we rush off to war, but it does mean that we must stand for something. That we must stand with our allies, that we must confront our adversaries when necessary. And so on day 1 in the Oval Office, I will make 2 phone calls. The first will be to my good friend Bibi Netanyahu to reassure him that we will stand with the state of Israel. The second will be to the Supreme Leader of Iran. Truthfully, I don't think he'll take my phone call, but he will get the message, loud and clear. And the message is this: I don't care what deal you cut. New deal. Here's the deal. Until and unless you open every nuclear and military facility to real, anytime, anywhere inspections by our people, not yours, we, the United States of America, will make it as difficult as possible for you to move money around the global financial system. We can do that. We don't need anyone's permission. We don't need anyone's collaboration. I will do it because we must cut off the money flow to Iran. They are hell-bent on developing a nuclear weapon and hell-bent on sowing conflict in the Middle East by funding their proxies. And of course, ISIS must be defeated, and we have Sunni Arab allies as well as the Kurds who are fighting ISIS on the ground as we speak, and they need our help. So when King Abdullah of Jordan, a man I've known for 15 years, comes to this country begging us, in essence, for bombs and materiel for his fighting forces, we have not provided them, so he is going to the Chinese. I will provide them. The Egyptians are asking us to share intelligence. We haven't. I will. The Kurds have asked us to arm them for 3 years. We haven't. I will. I will hold a Camp David summit with those allies who are fighting ISIS as we speak, and provide them the leadership, the support, and the resolve that they need to defeat this evil. And ISIS must be defeated. You see, Obama is always giving us a false choice. He's given us a false choice with Iran. He's given us a false choice with ISIS. The false choice is this. If you don't agree with what I'm doing or not doing, the only option is to march 10,000 American troops off to war. It simply isn't true. We haven't done a whole set of things. And with every single action I just talked about, how we push back against Putin, how we push back against ISIS, the phone calls to Bibi Netanyahu and the supreme leader of Iran, the message will go out throughout the world. America is back in the leadership business. Our president must understand bureaucracies and how to cut them down to size and hold them accountable. I do, and I will count on your help and your support to help me do so. She must understand technology. Mrs. Clinton, you cannot wipe a server clean with a towel. You do not prevent a server from being hacked by guarding it with 2 Secret Service agents. Although it turns out perhaps the thing she has been most afraid of all along is that someone would get their hands on that server. And finally, and perhaps most importantly of all, and I will close with this, we need a president in the Oval Office who understands what leadership is. Leadership is not about power, although power can sometimes help a leader. Leadership is not about celebrity. It is not about fame. It is not about how big your office is. It is not about your title. It is not about your airplane or your helicopter. Leadership, the highest calling of leadership, the mission of leadership is to challenge the status quo. The status quo of Washington, D.C. needs challenged now. I have done that all my life. That's how you go from secretary to CEO. You challenge the status quo. But the highest calling of leadership is to unlock potential in others. And we now need a president of the United States who will work with the citizens of this great nation to unlock the potential of this nation in the 21st century. Thank you so very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Crop TV.